Hey there, everybody. So this should be a pretty short video lesson to go through some of the information for maintaining a professional stance. So this is another element of communication skills in this sort of module of skill building we're going through. And I'll be asking you to practice some of them throughout the next week. So I think that the 5 elements that I've outlined on the PowerPoint of word choice, assertiveness, negotiation, problem-solving method, and view deconstructing questions are really good ways to establish and maintain a kind of presence that appears to be professional throughout lots of different types of situations and scenarios. And so we're going to go through these little segments, these 5 components, and I'll be asking you to practice some elements of them. So for word choice, some of this is kind of self-explanatory, but important nonetheless, and often forgotten. So with word choice, there are some kind of do's and don'ts, and specifically I've kind of given you a list of things to avoid and some things to try to utilize a little bit more often. In a professional role, the attitude of meeting the person where they are and accepting what you find there is sort of the background of what words you choose to use during conversations with them. So anything insulting, judgmental, belittling, degrading, things like that would maybe obviously be avoided. It's not always so obvious in the moment for some, but it's worth preparing yourself for, because one day you might need to remind yourself of that fact. And also avoiding needless complication or complexity, and instead favoring a straightforward and direct but sympathetic or sensitive sort of manner in which you choose words. So a real specific way of staying simple is to avoid technical jargon. So jargon refers to wording or phrases that have their place in a really narrowed world, right? So a field of study might very often use a certain word or phrase and know what it means. But outside of that field of study, people might not be so familiar with it. So using kind of real world language is always a good way of simplifying language. And using kind, warm, friendly types of language, even if you're having a great degree of difficulty with a person, can do at least one of 2 things. It helps them know that even though you're having trouble with them, you don't feel that they're trouble, and it actually helps you convince yourself of that fact if you might be having a hard time convincing yourself of that fact. So that's a little about word choice. Assertiveness. If you were to imagine a line on one hand, one extreme being aggression, and on the other extreme being passivity, like being walked over, assertiveness is some range in the middle between those 2 things, between passivity on one hand and aggression on the other. And I think it's useful to be able to know kind of what assertiveness is, but it's another type of usefulness to know how to practice it. And so what I mean by practicing assertiveness is I've given 3 suggestions. These are just my suggestions, but worth experimenting with. The first being what's called self-distancing. Self-distancing, very appropriately in the climate of social distancing here, is basically like acknowledging that there's a part of you that's kind of watching what you do, say, think, and feel. And there's another part of you doing, saying, thinking, and feeling. And I know that can be a little of an enigmatic kind of or puzzling thing to think about. But if you were to consider, hovering above yourself, looking down at yourself in a situation, that would be an example of how you might try to practice self-distancing. It's a little like dropping out of your own thoughts and kind of view yourself from the side or view yourself from another's perspective. And that can be helpful because you're not quite so wrapped up in your own immediate reactions to the other. So assertiveness is usually called for when there's conflict, right? So when there's conflict, there's a lot of reactivity. Stepping out of that reactivity, taking the vantage point of the observing self as opposed to the experiencing self. That's something you might want to play with if it doesn't make immediate sense, but it's worth trying out. And mindfulness skills of self-observation are really directly support that. So you should try that as a good way of getting into it. In addition to that, reminding yourself of two complementarities, that you both, in a situation of conflict that you're handling with assertiveness, you both have a right to express what you think, to pursue what you think is right, but you also have a responsibility to stand up for yourself, to let them speak, and to make sure that you speak and are heard. So that balance of right and responsibility is something that you might have to work at to find a balance. Okay, not overemphasizing one or the other. And lastly, somewhat simply, just telling yourself it's okay. Telling yourself things will be all right, even if I feel really wrapped up in this challenging scenario. Reminding yourself that things aren't fully finished yet. Things are still unfolding, and that means that things can get better, things can change, so it's all right. And actually saying that to yourself can be quite helpful. Next, negotiation. I've put up a few possible steps of how to process through a negotiation scenario. Negotiation is when there are at least two parties of views that disagree or differ, and sometimes even strongly. And so I've given you kind of a few ideas about how to process through that. It should be noted that when negotiations are taking place in a professional setting, subject boundaries and time boundaries are really important. What that means is you establish what you're going to be talking about in a negotiation setting and how long you're going to talk about it before you finish the meeting and then go about your day and your relationships. Because you may need to negotiate with people that you work with all the time, or that you work around a lot, or that you have to interact with in other ways. And if that negotiation spills over into your relationship with them, then you're just arguing, negotiating subtly in your relationship all the time. So package it up, the negotiation session, in a neat little box where you'll have a meeting for it. You'll open the discussion, you'll close the discussion, and then you'll revisit it as necessary. It's really important. I think it's useful to take the skills of self-awareness that we've been talking about and really put them into use. Assertiveness being a part of that kind of too. But also more of the active listening kind of component of building some empathy and trying to understand the other's perspective. That's kind of your platform where you start with negotiations. After that point, you're sharing ideas and exploring options. You should definitely ask your colleagues or friends or family even, just if it's appropriate to talk about it, just to confer with them to make sure you're being objective, to make sure you're thinking through options fully and things like that. And when you brainstorm solutions with the person you're negotiating with, do your best to maintain an open and non-judgmental stance about what you're hearing in terms of possible options. That opens the door for lots of solutions that the doors which are closed by kind of judgment and narrowed focus on one's own opinion. And it's useful, I think, when you enter into a negotiation setting, some combination of four things are going to happen by the end of it. You're going to have full or partial resolution. You're going to have no resolution. And also your relationship with the person is going to improve in some way, or it's going to deteriorate in some way. The kind of staying the same in relationship may happen, but in general it's useful to think about our relationships always kind of flowing in change. So treat it like you're either going to make your relationship stronger or more caustic and a little weaker, and aim toward the former, of course. So the next element, the problem-solving method. It's a really prescribed and straightforward way to deal with problems and to help others deal with problems. So this is a tool you can use with other people that you're helping, troubleshoot problems with. It's really direct and straightforward, and it's almost like verbatim. This is like a script. You ask, in reference to a problem, what have you tried as a solution? What happened when you tried it? You also ask, what have you thought of to try? What do you think would happen if you tried it? And then to kind of give a little nudge extra if you're helping someone else. We've talked about this possible option, and we've talked about this possible option. Things you've shared with me, you've thought about doing. Which of those do you want to try first? It's a little bit of a push, like to start trying something in a new way. Lastly, view deconstructing questions. These are not to convince someone that they're wrong. These questions are not to prove that someone's beliefs are false or invalid. It's to help a person or help yourself fully know your own thoughts and beliefs. Okay, it's like putting a fine-tooth comb through them, so you know what you think really clearly. You know what you believe really clearly. Asking these series of questions, and it is kind of meant to be sequential, can be helpful in clarifying that. And new beliefs can come out of it, or the same beliefs can be strengthened with more conviction. So asking, is the belief true? And how can you know if it's absolutely true? That kind of thing is specifically helpful to ask with negative self-views. When I think of myself as being a bad worker, a bad husband, a bad person in general, whatever else, challenging that by saying, is it true? Like almost demanding evidence. How do you know it's true? How could you even know if it's true? And secondly, it asks how you react when you hold this view. When I'm thinking that I'm a bad person, I might be pretty unhappy, and I might stop doing things with other people. I might actually be nasty to other people and not act as a very good person. Asking those questions connects the dots between belief and action. That's really useful. Does holding this view help you feel the way you want and reach your goals? That's kind of like a cost-benefit analysis. Is this helpful for me to believe? And sometimes it's an obvious no, but I don't know how to change it, and that's okay. But sometimes holding a belief harms you, and you don't see that unless you ask yourself the question. Are there any alternative solutions or explanations? Excuse me. Are there any other ways of looking at this that you haven't thought about yet? Working through this list of questions, and it's open-ended. There are other ways to ask questions about fixed or solid views that might be softened or broken up a little to be seen more clearly. Can be really helpful on an individual level, like using them yourself, which I'll be asking you to do actually in your assignment, or helping someone else really clearly understand their own view of things. Again, though, this is not meant to be a weapon. It can be used as a weapon, which is unfortunate. People can tear down others' views just to make them feel exposed and dumb and, not unvalidated. It's not meant for that. It's meant to help people solidify or strengthen a view that is what they really think. Okay. So that's the bulk of this lesson, is those 5 components some of which I'll be asking you to practice. I did want to make a quick few notes about written communication. Just a kind of checklist, as it were, of things to go over when you're writing in a professional way. Ask yourself, make sure you know the purpose of your writing, the audience of the writing, make sure you're clear in your writing, and make sure you use language conventions purposefully if you do use them. That basically means the kind of balance of how professional, how familiar languaging should be. That's like with use of slang or even like contractions, like isn't instead of is not. That's a small hair to split. But in some written contexts, using contractions actually is considered too informal. So you'll need to know what to write out, what to spell out, and what not to. Yeah, I think that's about all I was going to say. You can look over the kind of finer bullet points on the writing slide, but in general, it has its pluses and minuses. Written communication, you miss a lot of nonverbals and ways of building relationship, but you also get to like look back at it and change things and edit it if you choose to. And the other side of written communication is that it's in black and white and it's documented. So that's another really important thing, really important reason to be extra careful about how you use written language, is that once it's written, and especially if it's sent, electronically, it's permanent. You should treat it like it's permanent, like anyone could have, like it could be brought up and read against you at any point. So you need to make sure that you know what you write and why you write it, and that it's exactly what you meant. Okay, that's it for this little lesson on maintaining a professional stance. Take a look at the assignments for practicing the skills of this lesson, and we'll have our more intensive practice module to finish out the semester beginning soon. Make sure you submit the children's books annotated bibliography also, and as always, reach out to me with any questions or if you have any need of help.